the Adult Services Librarian. I'm excited to have this presentation here, and I'll pass it over to Jasmine.
I'm Jasmine. I work with the Upper Sugar River Watershed Association. I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator for that group. I also am kind of wearing two hats because in Dane County, I'm also part of the SCIP, or South Central Invasives Partnership. So one of my jobs focuses more on aquatic invasive species, the other focuses more on terrestrial. So kind of my wheelhouse is invasive species wherever you are, no matter how wet your feet are. So, and today I'm kind of going to go into a little bit about what invasive species are, just so that we have kind of basic understanding with everybody what Wisconsin as a state calls invasive species and what that means. And then just talking about how important it can be to consider whether they're on the landscape and what we as individuals can do to make a difference with removing invasives, why, and how to replace them. So kind of a lot here, but we're gonna break it down. So initially, to be on the same page, I'd like to define invasive species, because this is a phrase that is used, but maybe not always used in the same way, and so I want to define what I'm using it as. So invasive species is kind of two things. It's a species that did not originate in Wisconsin, so this means prior to colonial movement into Wisconsin, these species are not present at this time. And then they have to kind of be causing or have the potential to cause harm to some degree. This can be harm to the environment, to people directly, or to the economy, okay? So that kind of makes it a little bit general, but I like to also point out at this point that these species are not considered invasive because they're bad. They're usually great species. They do great in their home environments. It's because of their location and their impacts that cause harm that we call them invasive, okay? So they're not categorically bad things or creatures. It's their placement and their impacts. So in Wisconsin, legally, part of the DNR definition breaks these species down into kind of two categories. Some invasive species are considered restricted, and so those are already present in the state to some degree. Usually they're pretty widespread, or they have a few large populations. They do have those negative impacts on the environment, people, or the economy. And it's unlikely that we're going to be able to completely eradicate them at this point, right? They're pretty established someplace to some degree. And so Wisconsin has rules then that restrict the transportation and the transferal of these species. You can't sell them or give them away to your neighbors. You can't spread them through the nursery trade, anything like that. But if you already have them on your property, you're not going to be legally liable to remove those, right? It's okay, right? We're going to suggest that you get rid of them if you can so they don't spread, but it's not the end of the world, right? You're not legally obligated, okay? And this is different than the second category that Wisconsin DNR has here for prohibited species. So these are invasive species that are not yet fully established. Maybe there's only a few small populations so far, or maybe it's not even present in Wisconsin yet, but in surrounding states, and so it has the potential to come into the state and cause harm. And so we want to prevent that full establishment of that species. And so it, again, is considered invasive because it's not original from Wisconsin and it has the potential to cause harm, but we actually may be able to prevent or eradicate it. So that's kind of that difference. And for this delineation, prohibited species cannot be possessed. You still can't buy it, sell it, or share it with your friends or neighbors, but you also are not allowed to have it on your property. If you are or do, you will be obligated to remove it. And a lot of times there are ways to get help in doing that financially or with education so that you know what you have, but you do have to get rid of those. And then if there are any questions at any point, please feel free to ask, okay? So then if we know that invasive species kind of have differing levels of concern about them and they have the potential to cause harm, I wanted to give a little bit of context in why these species are present in the first place in these areas. And there's a lot of ways that these species come into a new area. Sometimes it's intentional by people, and sometimes we did it accidentally, or they came in through expedited migration, okay? So first, I have this cartoon up here that kind of shows one pathway for these species to come to a new area, the aquarium trade or pet trade, right? You have a lizard that you have as a pet, or someone has a pet goldfish, and then for whatever reason, they can't have that pet or don't want it anymore, and so they think that leaving it to the lake will be fine, right? Let's put it into the stream, let it go free. I get that sentiment, right? Nobody wants to maybe flush your fish for no reason, but letting it go in the environment is not the best alternative for the animal or plant, but also for the environmental recourse, right? And so there are activities that groups like the Upper Sugar Watershed and others do where you can surrender those pets and they can be readopted, right? There are alternatives to releasing them into the lake. Another pathway that was really common and still moved around these species was through the Great Lakes shipping region. This ship on this picture shows water being released from the ballast, or a hold where they take in water to help balance the ship with cargo in one location and then release that water in a different location. Makes sense that that would have been a very large pathway for invasive species to move from other continents where we were picking up goods and things and moving them to the Great Lakes. It was great at moving cargo, also great at moving species. But it was not intentional, right? We didn't think that this was happening. We didn't know that it was happening to the same extent, but we also weren't really checking at that time, right? Now we know that this is a concern. Another way that we can unintentionally move these species is through our recreational activities. This picture on the screen shows a boat, just a small fishing boat probably, and it has a species of aquatic invasive plant called Eurasian water milfoil. It kind of drapes really nicely on the back of that boat when it gets pulled out of the boat landing, and it actually can survive for a fairly long time outside of water if it's kept damp. And so if you take this boat fishing in one location and then a couple days later you want to go fishing again in a different location and this plant gets back into the water, it's going to live, reproduce, and be in a new location. So there are ways that what we do for fun can also accidentally move these species. A lot of times these species were also a benefit at the time. A lot of invasives were brought in intentionally to help with things like erosion control along a highway construction, or because we thought they were beautiful, right? People like plants that they're familiar with. And when a lot of people came to this country from other countries and continents, we wanted to bring the plants and the foods that we knew with us, which is a totally human thing to do. We just didn't realize some of the implications of letting those species into a new environment, right? Without their checks and balances, their diseases and predators to kind of keep their population under control. So we didn't realize it, but there was a reason we brought them at the time. And again, that's that point, right? We thought it was a good idea at the time, or it was beneficial to us in some way, but that was because we didn't fully understand the ramifications that continued after that. These species that are usually invasive are also kind of a specific type of species a lot of times, right? Not every non-native species is problematic or causes harm. You can think about a dandelion as an example that I like to use, right? This is a non-native species to Wisconsin. It's from Europe originally, and it's out there, right? It's in our lawns, and it kind of can be annoying if you're trying to have a beautiful grass lawn, but we don't call it invasive. It's just a weedy thing, right? But it's not causing harm to people. It's not poisonous, right? You can touch it without being harmed. It's not getting into cornfields and hurting yield. It's not that strong. And it's not hurting our economy of the fishing or boating industry, right? Or any other economic impact like that. So it's just a weed. It's not invasive. And invasive species usually have a little bit more gusto, if you will. They're really good at what they do. A lot of times they're considered generalist, so they can handle a lot of different moisture levels or sunlight levels, right? They can handle the shade or the sun. A lot of times they were brought to Wisconsin without, like I said, any of their predators, herbivores that would eat them, other diseases that would kind of reduce their vigor, and so they don't have that to slow them down. They also usually are really fast growing and really good reproducers. So this example that I have on the screen, you see those purple flowers that have kind of multiple stalks there that are covered in many flowers per stalk. And this is a purple loosestrife. This is an invasive wetland plant. And it's really good at that reproductive strategy because in one season, it can grow up and flower with all of those stalks. And each stalk has been found to produce at least 100,000 viable seeds per stalk. Many stalks on there, a couple million seeds produced in one summer, right? That's kind of hard to compete with if you're a native species that only produces tens or even hundreds of seeds, right? Especially for this species that lives next to water. The water's going to move all those seeds. It's a big impact. Yeah?
Is that considered prohibited or
restricted? Yeah, good question. So purple loosestrife is considered restricted in Wisconsin because it is more common currently. Yep. It is not considered prohibited. It's a little bit already established. Yeah, good question. The fun part about this invasive species, if there is one, right? And there's always kind of one. This invasive species, we actually have a tactic that is other than just chemical herbicide or manual pulling of this species. We have what's called a biocontrol for this species. And so we have, from its native habitat, the native habitat of the purple loosestrife plant, there is a purple loosestrife beetle that eats only the leaves and flowers of that plant. And so what's cool is, in the 90s, the FDA did a bunch of testing and trialing in the lab to see if this beetle would eat purple loosestrife and only purple loosestrife, so that we could release it and it would help to kind of be a check and balance on that species so that other native species had room to grow and continue to persist. And it was a success. So since the early 90s, we have been using these purple loosestrife beetles as our comrades to help us kind of reduce the vigor, reduce the number of flowers that are produced every year, so we reduce the number of seeds that are produced every year. Plus, it's a volunteer program that we do where folks can actually grow these beetles, rear them, help them to reproduce, and protect them while they have babies. And so you, as a volunteer, can be a part of having this little habitat with all these beetles and then releasing them into an environment near you to help eat the purple loosestrife, which is pretty fun. You know, they don't look like a whole lot. The little tan, they're like half a centimeter long, 2/3 of a centimeter, but they're kind of cute. And you do get attached to them, right? You see them all summer munching away. It's pretty fun. So we do have a tactic other than just chemicals for this one, which is nice because, again, it's near water. All right. And then just to round out, there's a lot of invasives, so there's a lot of different impacts that you can see, but I wanted to just provide some scope in case you've heard of some of these. Like I mentioned, some of these were brought for erosion control prevention, but conversely, there's some species of invasives that when they grow in an area, they increase erosion because nothing else can grow under them. The main example is a honeysuckle bush. If you ever had any honeysuckles on your property, it's a pretty green shrub. It has very nice smelling flowers in the spring with red or orange berries, but it shades out everything under the shrub. So if you look up under a honeysuckle, you'll see no herbs, no grass, nothing. And so if that's on any sort of a slope and it rains, erosion will usually increase. So that can be an impact. Water nutrient levels, pH, sediment, and oxygen, this is a big deal in lake and water systems because the Eurasian water milfoil that I mentioned earlier can really change a lot of these metrics, and any of those metrics that change can impact the fish life if you want to fish in an area, or the macroinvertebrates, the buggies and things that live in there, because they require certain amounts of nutrients and oxygen to persist. They can also change that light availability. I kind of mentioned that with the honeysuckle shrub, right? It's changing the system in a forest where nothing under that can grow because there's no light getting to the ground. I also like to add this charismatic invasive species of the sea lamprey. So this is a species that was brought in by that ballast water in the Great Lakes, like we mentioned. It usually is a ectoparasite, like a leech, where it's a parasite on the outside of your body instead of the inside. But it's a parasite to fish in the Great Lakes now that it's been brought in. And there are native species that are parasites like this, but these sea lamprey are way larger. So usually parasites don't kill their host, right? But these actually will kill their host. And so this, there's recent research that came out that showed that one sea lamprey can kill 40 pounds of fish per year just from their being a parasite on their skin and taking their bodily fluids. So they can have a high impact and change those trophic regimes, right? How many fish live and die can really change that whole lake system. And they can also change the habitat suitability. We'll see a picture of garlic mustard in a moment. This is one that's pretty common in southern Wisconsin, so you may have seen it. It was originally brought over for food because you can eat it, you can make pesto with it, it's actually really delicious. But it can change the soil chemistry because it exudes chemicals that can inhibit the growth of other things around it. So it's going to make it so that garlic mustard can grow and only garlic mustard can grow in that location. And I know these seem like a lot of impacts, but then we don't really talk about this a whole lot here today, but all of these impacts are then added onto stresses that native habitats already have, like climate change, habitat fragmentation or destruction, urbanization, right? A lot of things are changing the environment for our native species, and invasive species is just one extra pressure that they have to deal with in order to persist and thrive. So it's kind of a collaborative impact. And it's not all just about, the chemistry or the things that you can't see. There's impacts to people and what we can do and how we can interact with our native environments. So there's definitely a lot of cultural loss. This bottom left-hand corner here shows some baskets that are woven out of specifically black ash tree bark. And if you've heard about the ash trees that are having some problems, there's an invasive beetle called the emerald ash borer that really can kill a lot of ash trees in an area. And so if you have that invasive species harming the ash trees in your area, you're not going to have those living ashes that you need to make the baskets that can be a part of cultural practices, right, that you grew up with and your ancestors had. So that's definitely something that can be lost if we don't protect from invasive species. Also, foodstuffs, right? We love our cranberries and blueberries in Wisconsin. Both are native species that if we don't provide room for them to grow and persist, if invasive shrubs take over instead, we're not going to have the same resources available. And then brook trout, or trout in general, our fisheries really depend on certain water chemicals and water chemistry and habitats in order to persist, right? They need that cold water that is free of those invasive plants a lot of times. So we have some potential things that would not be available to us anymore if invasive species are allowed to kind of change that system. We talked a little bit about the recreational impacts here, where like if you're going boating or fishing or even paddling to some extent, these invasive species can inhibit your use of the water. So on the left hand here, you have a boat propeller that's covered in the invasive zebra mussels. These are common in a lot of southern lakes, including the Madison chain lakes. So if you leave any equipment or even the shoreline can be covered in these mussels, and they're very sharp. So not only is your equipment going to be impacted, it makes it harder to go swimming without shoes on, right? And just the simple things that you want to use your water for. It can be get tied up in your propeller and cause an issue with your engine. But also this picture on the far right, I took this summer at a lake that has Eurasian water milfoil, and I was gonna go paddling. And I did. I eventually was able to get through it, but it even made kayaking through that difficult, right? Because you just get dragged by those plants that are more prolific than the native pond weeds would be, right? A lot of times, it's not that we're looking for a clear water lake, right? Plants in lakes are healthy in Wisconsin lakes, but this is to a degree where it's one species, right? And it's just a mat. So even fish aren't able to go through it and use that space like they would normally, right? It's changing that system. And then I like to bring up this example because it is a human health impact. This light greenish, yellowy flower and kind of this upside down umbrella shape is called wild parsnip. So this is one that is a really big concern because it does have human health impacts. And on the right is a mown trail with just tons of this yellow-green flower on both sides. And if it were me, I would not walk on that trail without shoes, pants, and long sleeves. Because for this plant, if you touch it, or it touches your skin, the seeds, the stem, the leaves, any part of it, it will leave an oil on your skin that can, if you then are in the sun for any amount of time, will create a chemical burn. And it will actually burn to the point where it can produce second-degree chemical burns and give you blisters that will scar. So this is one where it's a real problem for natural areas, playgrounds, areas where children want to play, because it could really hurt you, right? So this is an invasive species that's concerned for harm, as well as, right, it's the only species growing there. So it's not good habitat, and it's dangerous. A little bit less intense looking here, but I have on the screen here a couple of pictures, and to give an idea of what it can look like in a forest without invasive shrubs specifically, or without invasive herbs, right? So a lot of times on the right you see are some large open-grown oaks with a nice big cathedral canopy and some nice flowers in the understory, but it doesn't have a ton of shrubs in it, and you look like you could walk through that, right? You could go for a nice walk in this forest, and that's what we as humans really enjoy. That's why we usually have growing things and then big park trees. We enjoy that feel. So what would change if you kind of had a bunch of those honeysuckle shrubs come in is it might become less easy to go for a hike in that area. In the same vein here, I have it zoomed up here, a native early spring flowering plant in the forest. It's called Dutchman's Breeches because they look like little pants upside down. That's the flower. It's one of my favorites. And in the middle picture here, it's spread all throughout this forest. There's ferns, there's mayapple, another native flowering plant, a bunch of different species in this forest floor. And if you were to have, say, garlic mustard come in, it would be the only thing you would have there, right? You wouldn't have those flowering plants or the same species that you were used to. And then what if the shrubs came in as well? This picture kind of gives a little bit of scale, where this volunteer it's early spring, so not a ton of leaves yet, but this volunteer is about as tall as all of these shrubs are. And so in order for him to actually get into here, we had to cut through all of these shrubs in order to even just walk through this forest, right? So it really changed how you can use the landscape. And then there's just some intrinsic things that have value when you go out to a natural area that are hard to quantify, but would change if you had invasive species come into that area. Like I mentioned, that right picture there has a prairie landscape with a big open-grown oak in a savanna type setting. That's a really fun setting that most people enjoy. It's a lot harder to do the cultural practice of prescribed burning if there's a bunch of invasive shrubs and things that can make that burn less safe, right? It's a lot safer if it has just low-growing understory plants and then like oak leaf litter. So it changes whether you're able to do that prescribed burn safely. And then it just changes what wildflowers you may be used to, right? This is a Virginia bluebell, which is native to Wisconsin as well. It would also not just change forests. I know I used a couple of forest examples, but it could change our prairie landscapes. If you think back to that parsnip picture, this one's a little bit more inviting, right? Nothing here can hurt you if you touch it. It's going to smell wonderful. It's going to look wonderful. The pollinating insects are going to be all over the place. It's a very nice location. And then the picture on the right there is one of my favorite plants in the state, especially if you like to go paddling or get onto the water, because this is the American lotus. It's not super common in all parts of the state anymore, but it's a really beautiful dinner plate sized yellow flower. It just sticks up there, you paddle around it, it's looking at you like face level. It's pretty beautiful. So you don't want to lose that and just have that Eurasian water milfoil mat under you. At least I don't. Because I like to do things like this and use the water, we like to go through and walk through those prairies and enjoy those locations safely. And this is just a silly one that I had to put up here because this is, I'm taking the picture, and then my coworker here, we're doing a lake survey, and she's looking for anything else in her boat that we can put onto this leaf. Because this is the leaf of the American lotus flower that we saw on the previous slide, and it's huge. And when we were out here a couple summers ago, they're like, oh yeah, frogs can get on here, muskrats will even sit on these leaves, and we're like, what? No way, right? How much weight can these actually take? And then we emptied our entire boats, and it still didn't fall. Like, we literally did our shoes and everything, it could hold it all up. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I feel like a family of muskrats could hang out on this and still be fine. It's pretty cool, right? It's silly. But what would be lost in our silly experience if it had only been Eurasian water milfoil here and we wouldn't have had these lotus leaves to mess with, right? It's just a part of us experiencing this area, which I don't want to lose and I want other people to have as well. But essentially, it is also not all just about us, right? There are a lot of other species that really need space in these native systems as well, right? We want to make sure that they can continue to persist also, right? Our frogs, our butterflies and caterpillars, beetles and bees, and even the spiders, right? Those are great. And I also like to mention that all but this picture was taken from a 5-yard by 5-yard native planting in the middle of Madison, right? So it doesn't take a lot to provide that space for some of these species. It is not. Good question. This is a native beetle. I know, I didn't throw it in here to test people, but the emerald ash borer does have a little bit different head, and it doesn't have those red legs. But good question. It is a green beetle though. Yes. So all of that is to say, where does that leave us, right? What does our day-to-day impact look like? Not all of us have a professional job in invasive species, so what can happen now? And the answer to that is really a lot of things, small things or big things, right? All work. You could be like these folks in this picture that are outside of New Glarus. They're working to remove invasive species in a new town park, right? So they're working in their community to reduce invasive species. You could do this on your property. Or when I lived and had a balcony, I had 2 pots of native asters on that balcony, which is actually where that bumblebee picture came from. So it can be as useful as a pot, right? And that can make a difference in your very local community. You also can talk to other people you know, right? Maybe they have no idea this is a thing. Maybe they don't know that on their property they have some invasive species that could be spreading seeds. And so you could have a conversation with them, see if this is something they've heard about. You also can make those changes on your property. And like I said, this can happen in urban environments, field edges, buffer strips. Really, anybody that has property can make subtle changes to improve their property and allow spaces for native species to persist while also reducing invasive species in that area. And we can also help in the ways that we have fun, right? Our recreational activities, because we talked about these being a lot of ways that things can be spread from place to place and become more of a problem. So if you go boating or canoeing or kayaking, right? Just cleaning off your equipment, drying it, making sure there's nothing stuck to it and moving to your next location is a huge benefit. If you go hunting or paddling, the same applies, right? Clean off your boots when you're going hunting or wading. Clean off your decoys or your equipment. I like this picture because, yes, your boots are possibly moving seeds from one hiking location or park to another, but also the doggo is in this picture, right? Things stick in their fur and mud sticks in their paws. You also probably don't want it in your home, but it's also useful not to pass it to the next dog park, right? And then any other recreational activities that you do, whether it's in your landscaping, fishing, what bait you use, not releasing your worms after you're done fishing, some very simple actions that don't inhibit your recreation, but can really help your natural community. And you can also get involved if you're wanting okay, I kind of do these things, or those are easy, what more can I do? There are groups specifically that focus on invasive species in their communities. So just an example, because we're in Dane County, the South Central Invasive Species Partnership is a group of just people, individuals in the community, as well as government agencies, nonprofit agencies that all work together to help each other remove invasive species and learn about them. So you could be a part of a group in your area. And this is the last example here with kind of what groups like the SKIP group can do. The picture on the left is a picture in a savanna prairie complex, and you can kind of see it, but this big oak tree is right here behind all of these shrubs and invasive plants. And so what they do at the Stock Prairie Conservation Alliance, who's a part of that invasive species group, every Wednesday they go out and they free an oak. So they try to remove these understory shrubs from underneath an oak to allow it to have its open grown breathing room. And this is really important because these oaks will, if they continue to be choked out from resources from the soil and they're shaded up under in this understory, they will actually start to drop large limbs that are low down, and it makes them less healthy and less able to persist things like diseases that may come in or climate change impacts from storms or heat stress, right? It's all that compounding things. And so they free those invasive shrubs, which gives them a little bit more room to breathe and hopefully remain healthy. You also can just kind of keep an eye in the areas around you, right? There are ways that you can, not everybody is an expert in plant or animal identification. Not everybody knows what kind of crayfish you look at in a stream, and that's okay. We luckily are in a time when there are apps for everything, and there are apps to help you know what you're looking at. And then if that all fails, you can always email someone like me, folks at the DNR, and be like, what is this thing I saw in the water or on the land? I'm concerned about it. I've never seen it before. And that's fine. That's why we're here, right? The apps can get you kind of in the right family, hopefully, but then you can always reach out if you're still not sure. The other thing is once you think you've seen something, you're like, okay, I don't know this. This might be that Eurasian water milfoil you talked about that I got on my boat. There are apps that can let you report it. EdMaps is a great one where you just take a picture, it gives you a GPS point, and you can send it in and be like, I think this is Eurasian water milfoil. And then someone on the other end, a real person, will verify that and let folks at the DNR know or myself know, hey, we need to go check that out. Someone said this is here. And that's great because we can't be everywhere, we can't see everything, and so we can actually take steps after we're given this information. I can share these other links as well or talk about them at the end, but it's kind of how to report a species to the DNR or how to use a really fun tool that the DNR has on its website where you can be like, okay, I think I saw Eurasian water milfoil at Lake Monona. Is it usually found there, or is this something new I need to report? And you can actually go to this viewer, and it has this map, and it'll show all the points where Eurasian water milfoil has been found. And so you can be like, oh, this is where it is, and they already know it's here. Okay, right, I don't need to do anything. They already know this is around. Plus, it's just a really cool map that you're like, what is where, right? So it's kind of cool. We can talk about that later if you'd like. All right. That kind of rounds me out. I wanted to add my email up here. We also have our website at Upper Sugar, which provides a little bit more information about a lot of the programs that I touched on. But I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you have any comments for me, anything you want to add, I'm happy to do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How would you recommend balancing plants that you love that may be more aggressive with, trying to be cognizant of our environment and invasive species? I'm thinking specifically of people who love lily of the valley or similar plants that, they have their great purpose, a lot of nostalgia, early bloomer, etc., but isn't native.
Yeah, I would say that's a really great point. Lily of the Valley specifically, it's one of my younger sister's favorite flowers. She loves everything about it, right? But it isn't native to Wisconsin. So what I would say to her is, one, we know it's not prohibited in the state, so it's not illegal for you to have it. Okay, you're not gonna get in trouble for having it on your property. Good to know. right? So you can keep it on your property. I would say make sure you don't give it to your neighbors, right? Even if they really want some, don't do that because it's just for on your property. You can have it. You can't legally share it. Okay. And then the other thing I would say is you don't have to get rid of it. I know that's weird. I would suggest that if you are okay with it, that you could. There are many native plants that you could replace with it. Native trilliums. You can buy at native plant nurseries. Don't collect it in the wild, obviously. Get it from a native nursery. But they are also spring flowers. They're bright, large, beautiful flowers that could live in the same shady environment as that lily of the valley. So I would say, you're allowed to keep it. That's totally fine. I understand the connection. But also maybe just explore your options, right? What's there that's native that could replace it if you decide to later down the road? Yeah, good question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I'll talk to you and show you my picture.
Sure.
But, so we have we live in town in Oregon.
Okay.
And, but a largish area, I don't want to say where that black
Yeah.
carpeting is.
Couple yards, yeah.
It's got 2 really big oak trees. It's got a couple of hickory trees, but it also has a bunch of plants.
Okay.
Some of which I don't think belong.
Okay, sure, they may not be native plants. Okay.
But it also has some native plants as well.
Okay.
And we're kind of at a loss as to how to
Like manage that
it.
spot?
And last year, actually, I did try to manage it, and I wound up with something all over me, poison something.
Okay.
And I don't even know what it was.
Okay.
I was, like,
Now
that
you're
kinda
nervous.
scarred me.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I want to go back in there, but I also can't handle it. Like, it's out of control.
It's just too much, yeah.
Yes. So now we're like, do we try to kill it all and start over, or where do we even begin?
Yeah, I would say the first thing that you're gonna wanna do is know what you're getting into, right? If it is poison ivy that you're maybe getting into, or I would say that would be my guess because it sounds too shady for wild parsnip to like it under all those trees.
Yeah.
But either way,
It's a fair amount of stuff, too.
okay, then it could be maybe some parsnip as well. So I would want to find out, what do I have here? I would say it would be fine if you wanted to thin out those trees depending on how many you want to eventually be full-sized in that small location.
The oaks are full.
They're already big. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll show you pictures.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would say overall, yeah, find out what you have so that you know what is native and what's not. And then even if something is native, like sumac shrubs are native, but they can get really big and become a problem, especially in a small plot, right? So you could find out native or not native, and then you could still thin out as needed. Even if something's native, it's not always useful in a small backyard setting because some can be aggressive native plants too, right? Some grow very quickly. Canada goldenrod is one of those, right? It's native. It's a great thing for pollinator. It actually doesn't cause hay fever. That's ragweed. It's a misconception, but it's fast growing. It grows super tall. It can be really big. So it's not always appropriate in your yard if you don't want to. So that's fine. Does that make sense? So yeah, know what you have and then feel free to, even if it's native, if you need to thin it out, do so. Yep, that's what I would recommend.
How would you recommend doing it?
If we know it's not like poison ivy, then you could go in and if it's like thin enough, you could use like loppers or something. If they're like, you can't really pull these plants. If you can pull them and it's a small enough area that you have the person power to do that, great. If you don't, there are some quick acting herbicides like Roundup, which doesn't, it's not residual in the soil. It's not gonna last a really long time and be a problem for the surrounding plants. So that can be something you can use to make sure the shrubs that you don't want don't come back. And that way you're not working on it forever, if that makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was just going to mention, I was always sort of unaware of what I had around me until I started using a couple different apps.
Sure.
That just opened up my world. I'm not an expert. I don't remember all this stuff very well, but when I got the app, I learned what almost everything that I'm dealing with. I learned what it is.
Yeah.
And that helped me to go to the next step. Without that, it's very hard to go to the next step.
Yeah, so those apps can be a nice tool to like, yeah, even if you don't learn all the plants in Wisconsin, you can be like, what's in my backyard so I know what to do with it. Exactly. Exactly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
From my app, I noticed that we've got this white snake root.
Yes.
In multiple spots in our yard.
Yeah.
And it talks about how it used to kill humans. Is it really that bad?
Don't eat it. So if I'm remembering correctly, white snake root is one of those that if livestock eat it and then you drink the milk of the livestock, it can harm you. So if I'm remembering back to my history, check me on this, but I think it's one of those where like one of the Lincoln's kids drank the milk and it made them sick or something like that. So, when this was out in pastures and cows were eating it and people didn't know what, the impacts, it could cause human harm in that way. But it's a pretty indirect harm nowadays because nobody's, you can touch it, yep, no part of it is gonna be, right. Yep, that will not hurt you. So it is a native, but I will say it is one of the faster growing shade natives. So I have that in my area as well, and it will cover an area. So if you don't want it to just be white snake root, even though it's native, you'll have to pull it some or suppress it somehow. But yep, good question. Yeah.
Yeah, we had to do that with the plant natives in one spot just to test them.
Yeah.
And mist flower started to pop up across almost the whole area where I planted like a half a dozen natives.
Okay.
So we had to thin it out.
Yeah. It was just the only thing. Yep.
Crowded everything else out.
Yep.
Fine, but it's like I was thinking I'm gonna have this like natives garden area or this little. It almost looks about the size of a rain garden. And I was thinking, well, it's gonna be this is gonna be great. Well, it needs to be managed.
Yeah, as much as we say native plants don't take as much effort on our part or management, which they usually don't need watered like horticultural plants need. They don't usually have as many diseases. There's still impacts, right? People always burned prairies. There was always impact from humans in one way or another. We also just don't have the other things that would have been controlling certain things, right? Not all the parasites are in that small prairie planting probably. There's no bison in there creating wallows and eating just the grass and not the flowers as much, so it's still something where if you plant a prairie or a garden of natives, it's still something you're gonna steward, right? You're still gonna have a positive impact on it, especially because invasive species will probably come in from birds and other things. Yeah, yep, good point. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time with certain plants establishing. Maybe it's just my patience.
It does take a lot of that with natives. Patience is good.
I think if I planted maybe by next year, it should be fairly strong. Well, I planted a really small prairie drops plant.
Yep.
And it's still 3 years on, and that thing is still so small. And now I'm like, well, is the soil bad, or what's going on? Maybe that's just a slow.
Yep, some of those plants are just slow developers to start with. I will say sometimes I planted a compass plant, which has really big, really sandpapery leaves and really tall sunflower stalk. It may not flower for 25 years. These prairie plants live a long time. So that could be it. The other thing is sometimes the soil might just not be right from whatever was there before. If it was lawn and people fertilized a bunch, there could be excess nutrients that those prairie plants are just not as suitable for. So it could be impacts like that that are slowing it down as well. Yep.
The other thing I was going to ask, do you advocate for, so one of the things I was thinking about if I'm planting plants,
Yep.
it's been 3, maybe 5 years to establish.
Yep.
If I buy them already larger, I know they're more expensive.
Yep.
But if I buy them larger, is that gonna, do you ever advocate for that?
It will help. If speed is something you're like, this is in my front garden and I need it to look good in 2 years, not 10 years, right? It's in my front yard, it's a big deal to me or my neighbors or whatever. I would say buying larger is going to speed up how quickly they flower, how large and nice they look, definitely. That's where a lot of times if folks are in a hurry, or especially if it's a small enough area you can afford to do the plugs they call them, or the baby plants, a lot of people will do that instead of seeds because seeds can add a year or two to flowering and looking nice. Yep, definitely. The bigger it is when you buy it and plant it, the faster all of that is going to happen. Yep, yep. But it's more expensive, like you said. Yep. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions right away? Yeah. It's fine. Go for it. That's why we're here. Yeah. Yeah.
Three. So I live on the lake.
Okay.
Lake Wapisa.
Okay.
And where I'm trying a bunch of these different natives with some of my neighbors on each side of me.
Okay.
And on my property, because we have some areas that slope down to the lake.
Okay, shoreline kind of area.
Shoreline kind of
Okay.
area. They're different case, but they're similar. I'm struggling with, like, my neighbor has this bank that runs down to a rock wall which runs into the water.
Okay.
The bank is full of hostas.
Okay.
Her bank.
Yep.
So I was consulting with her about what she might be able to do, and I'm a rookie at this, so I said I really don't know for sure.
Yeah.
To replace some of the hostas, because she went out there and she was like digging all of them up, and there was just like bare earth.
Yep.
You know, right next to the lake. And
Yeah.
You know, just I don't know what to do but stop digging.
Yeah. Put some straw down at least or something. Yeah. Yeah.
So the one thing that I've noticed about the springtime,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if this is true with natives, but I've noticed there's not much, especially on hostas, there's not much, there's a root structure from last year, but there's nothing on top of the soil.
Yep. There's no like leaf litter or anything else to slow water down.
So it doesn't slow water down, which is what I'm
Yep.
driving at. Is
Yep.
Are some of these plants, like if you don't trim them down in the wintertime, like certain grasses, they will slow water down
Yep.
if you don't trim them?
Yes.
And is that something we should look at doing, these planting plants that you can leave and leave them over winter and then don't trim them?
I would say definitely. It's the same kind of idea of cover cropping on a farm, right? You put clover that lives or winter wheat or something that you plant in the fall and it grows throughout the winter. It holds the soil and produces something that will hold any residual as water rushes. That's exactly what you would want to do on that steep slope. There are a lot of wetland plants that could probably handle that kind of near the water but not totally wet area. That could be grasses, rushes, or even like native irises and flowers. That you could leave standing all winter. They produce larger root systems than just the little hosta roots, and they would hold more of that soil and cover that ground a little bit better for you. Yep, for sure. And I would definitely point you to a pamphlet for wetland plants in a little bit if you're interested. Yep. Any other questions or thoughts? I don't know if we have the capacity to answer streaming questions if they existed, but okay, sounds good. Thought I'd check. Awesome. Yeah. Yes. I work in Dane County as well as 5 other southwest Wisconsin counties, so Grant, Iowa, Greene, Lafayette, and part of Dane and Sauk. So I'm around in this part. I work in all of those areas. So if you're from any of those areas, you have questions about what you have on your property, how to report something you've seen, you can reach out to me. And that information can be found from our website, uppersugar.org, or at my email, which is my name, and then at uppersugar.org. Either of those ways is great to get a hold of me. Yeah, thank you. I am not. I am a paid professional. So I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the nonprofit. Yep. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for attending, your questions, and your attention. But let me know if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.